HRN listeners. As we celebrate our 15th year, we are deepening our commitment to giving voice to the next generation of food systems storytellers, and we need your help. Our internship and fellowship programs help activate new possibilities for underrepresented and underestimated young people through experiential journalism, audio engineering, and production training. Through these unique programs, HRN helps food equity stewards build essential workforce readiness skills that expand their potential and foster economic mobility. Please consider supporting these critical programs. And with a minimum donation, you can be entered to win a dinner for two at an amazing restaurant in one of 8 cities and tickets to a concert at a great venue in one of those cities. We have incredible partners across the country who have donated, as they also share our passion for helping to educate the next generation of food systems storytellers. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. And make sure you donate before March 31st. Thank you.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
But, for me, I've always paid most attention to who produces our food, who's actually doing the work that makes it possible for us to thrive and live. And how is that embedded in systems of global corporate capitalism? For it to get here, it's embedded in these transnational corporations whose goal is to make the higher and higher profit in every way they can, driving down the livelihoods and working conditions of working people all over the world. I think we have to see the ways in which our food is embedded in that.
You just heard from Dana Frank, a historian whose research reveals the power of collective action and what can be possible when we advocate for each other. In today's episode, we'll follow that thread between the edible and the political. Through inspiring and necessary conversations across the globe, we are examining how folks are changing the world of food, and how food has always been a part of changing the world. We're traveling through space and time to bring stories of trailblazers and revolutionaries, those who are truly breaking boundaries. I'm Matt Patterson, and this is Meat and 3 on HRN.
Meat and 3.
Meat and 3.
Meat and 3.
One meat, 3 sides.
Food, news, and storytelling.
A square meal for your ears.
Meat and 3.
For our first story, Rana Rudy reflects on how the Persian diasporic community connects to cuisine in the context of the women-led revolution currently underway in Iran.
I found that my memories of that time, I was very young, but they're like little flashes. They come into focus and then quickly go out of focus. And they're often triggered by food, like smell, the scent of certain ingredients evokes those memories quite profoundly. Or sound even, the sizzling of the pièce d'or, the golden onions when they're frying. So that's where I found the link between these recipes and my own personal stories.
That's Naz Daravian. Her story of nostalgia is familiar to so many Iranians. Iranians like my own dad, who were forced to flee after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, once the country was forever changed from the home that they once knew. My dad has not returned to Iran since he was young, and I've never had the chance to go. But in the past few months, I've found myself drawn to my Persian heritage in a deeper way than ever before. Watching the remarkable courage of Persian women from the sidelines in the U.S. has pushed me to find ways to support them. But it's also sparked something in me deeper down, something that's drawn me to incorporate and celebrate the Persianness in my life more. I've found myself craving the flavors of Persian cooking, tangy, bright ones like the yogurt and herbs of masta khiyar, and softer ones like saffron. I've learned to make my first Persian rice and tadik, the golden crispy rice that forms at the bottom of the pot when cooked just right. And I have a new desire to understand the words chanted in the protests I join and the songs I listen to, and I've started to learn Farsi. My desire to connect with my culture pushed me to wonder how many Iranian immigrants, unable to return, find connection to their home during a time of revolution. So I called up Naz, Iranian actress and author of the cookbook Bottom of the Pot.
those first few months, we saw Iranians in the diaspora come together and unite like we have never seen before. We are a very divided community. And those first few months, it was as if we all joined hands for the first time and put aside our petty differences in order to support the young, courageous people inside the country.
Naz describes growing up in a different generation in Iran.
Fear was my first reaction because I think many of us of my generation have been raised in a state of fear of you can't speak out, you can't speak up, of all the horrible things that they can do to you. So my first reaction was fear for these young people, but it was instantly taken over by awe and respect and pride.
Respect and pride for the incredibly courageous women fighting for the right to their freedoms in their home. The government that took over in 1979 stripped away what home meant from so many. For Naz, she left Iran when she was 8, a year after this revolution.
When we first moved to Canada, when I was 10 years old, it was a really difficult time for Iranians. It was right around the hostage taking. And the mainstream media, obviously the images that would flash across the TV screens that my friends would hear of Iran was just very one-sided, or, it was fear-inducing, and we were othered. I found that around our little dining table, when my little friends would stay past, the play date, and my mom would just make a simple rice, and they loved our food so much, my friends did. I could see the connection between tasting this food and really normalizing us as just human beings, as everyday human beings, just like themselves.
With the conflict between our countries, I've historically been shy about sharing Iranian food with friends. I can imagine for many people who are more familiar with the negative spiral of news on the Iranian government than its cuisine, there could be hesitancy to try the food. But Naz says,
I have never seen anyone reject Iranian food. Never. But yes, I think it has taken some time for people to become more familiar with it, or for it to be available in a more mainstream way to non-Iranians.
Naz shared her excitement for the growth of Iranian food and for the moment it might just be having.
I think it's a really exciting time for Iranian food. I am not a believer that food is the grand, equalizer and it will solve the world's problems. No, the world's problems are huge and immense. And I don't think that food will do that. But at the very, very, very least, it can maybe spark conversation. And that's all that I can hope for.
Growing up, my relationship with my Iranian heritage was complicated and confusing. Over the years, I've fallen in love with this side of me, cherishing the deep connections with my family, the uniqueness of the cuisine, and the connection to a people that is unbelievably strong. I've watched in awe and pride as the young, courageous women of Iran risk their lives to fight for their freedoms, and I have never been more proud to be of Persian descent.
Keep sharing these stories coming out of Iran. In any way that you can. There's no act too small to show that you support the Iranians who are seeking their basic human rights and freedom inside the country. Continue supporting Iranian cooks and cookbook authors and restaurateurs. If you haven't had Iranian food before, please, find an Iranian restaurant. We're everywhere. We really are. I think these are small gestures that mean a lot. And here's to a bright and free Iran.
For our next story, Liv Cunnins-Bergowitz takes us to Latin America.
Four companies, Chiquita, Fifes, Dole, and Del Monte, control approximately 80% of the world's banana sales. These companies own and subcontract farms, or in Spanish, fincas, in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, Colombia, and Ecuador, among some other countries. These multinational banana corporations wield tremendous power over their workers, over the industry, and even over state governments. These multinational corporations are indeed powerful, but so too are their workers.
There are 65,000 unionized banana workers in Latin America, of whom 5,000 are women.
Today I talked to Dana Frank, professor of history emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz, about her book, Bananeras, Women Transforming the Banana Unions of Latin America. From the early 20th century till today, banana workers have resisted the harsh practices of banana corporations. It's been workers, rather than the state government, that have challenged these corporations' unfettered power. These workers have continuously faced repression, violence, and even murder for resisting the power of the banana corporations. By the 1950s, banana workers across Latin America began forming unions. They organized collective power and were able to demand and win rights from these big corporations.
These are people that have union contracts that give them paid vacations. They give them a Christmas bonus. They give them health care in many cases, overtime pay. And they have these unions have really good contracts, some of which go back to the 1960s. I think we imagine that all workers in agriculture in Latin America are hyper exploited. Most or many of them are. But the banana sector is different. And it has this history of militant unionism that goes back for decades and decades.
There is so much to say on the history of labor organizing in the banana industry, and we'll include further resources in the show notes. But today we're hearing from Professor Frank about how women transformed the banana unions in the 1980s, and, in Professor Frank's words, forged a powerful politics of class and gender. Women began working in the banana industry in the 1960s. Women don't typically work on the agricultural side of production. Instead, they work in the packing plants, cutting and washing, putting stickers on the fruit, and packing them out for shipment. Oftentimes, these women are working 8 to 14 hours a day, sometimes even 7 days a week, in over 90-degree heat. Our story begins in 1985 in Honduras. A group of women who are rank-and-file members of Citra Terco, one of the big unions for Chiquita workers in Honduras, began to question the lack of women leadership in the union.
And they started pressuring the executive committee to institute certain demands about the empowerment of women. And it was very tricky because the union was 2/3 men, right? So this is a very interesting story about minority power.
The women had to convince the men that it was in their interest and the interest of the union as a whole for women to play a bigger role.
That's why the title of my book in Spanish is El Poder de las Mujeres es Poder Sindical, which is women's power is union power, because that's the case they had to make one by one. They talked to the men in their union, and that union at that point must have had 15,000 members. I mean, it was a big union. So eventually they got the Women's Committee recognized as an official committee of the union, and they started working to get women on the executive committee and all the big committees.
However, it wasn't enough to put women in leadership positions because many of these women weren't experienced leaders. So they began to host workshops on self-esteem and women's empowerment to teach each other how to lead.
And you'd have like 15 or 20 women for the day, and they talked about sex gender, what they would call sex gender systems, and machismo, and the way women had to ask for permission from their husbands or fathers to leave the house, even, let alone to be involved in the union. And I sat in on a lot of these workshops, and they're really powerful.
And in these workshops, the women didn't only educate one another.
They'd have workshops on sex gender systems or on certain issues that would sometimes have men in the workshops. It wasn't just a thing of just organizing women. They always incorporated men in the projects.
The work of the women in the Citra Terco Union inspired unions on a national level in Honduras. By the 1990s, COSIBA, which is the coalition of Honduran banana unions, it kind of brings a lot of those smaller unions together. They, inspired by Citra Terco, instituted a women's committee.
But the staff of COSIBA included men that would be there as part of the workshops as a role model for the men about non-sexist behavior. And if you look at my book, you can see there's a picture of a wonderful man named Chema Martinez who he's working on a sign for one of the workshops, and you can see he's like painting in a pink women's symbol, and like how often would you see this in the United States?
And as these women organized to empower one another and educate their male counterparts in the union, they also began advocating for so-called women's issues in their contracts.
little by little, they got women onto the executive council. They got women on all the committees. And then they started talking about, like, what are some of the things we can get in our contracts? So they start getting things like maternity leave into the contracts, right? Or issues about sexual harassment into the union contracts.
Since the 1980s, women have worked to carve out spaces for their leadership within the unions. Today, most of the unions have a secretary of women who specifically attends to the rights and interests of women.
And I think this is really important to understand when you're trying to think about Latin American feminism, or, they didn't see this as a separate struggle from their union. They saw the union as a way of empowering women, and all of that struggle intertwined. They would never have separated out the politics of women's empowerment from the politics of empowering the union and empowering those women as workers together with men.
Thank you, Professor Frank, for joining us on Meat and Three. Dr. Frank's forthcoming book from Beacon Press is about working class activism in the 1930s.
In this story, Rana Rudy and Elias Guerra introduce us to Japanese women breaking barriers behind the sushi counter. Here's Rana.
When dining at a sushi restaurant, I often opt for sitting at the bar. The chance to watch the chefs behind the counter as they delicately slice and mold slabs of fish and rice is fascinating to me. I've noticed, though, that there's a clear similarity between all the chefs behind the counters. Whether in San Francisco or Tokyo, it's always been a man behind the counter, cutting the fish, shaping the rice, and serving me. It's no secret that the restaurant industry is dominated by men, but they have a near monopoly on sushi. With over 30,000 sushi restaurants in Japan, it's estimated that less than 10% of sushi chefs are women. My co-producer Elias and I spoke with Yuki Chidui, one of that 10%, and one of the first women to own her own sushi restaurant.
I think the hardest thing about becoming a female chef in Japan is, of course, the battle against stereotypes and other people's perspectives.
The stereotypes stacked against women pursuing sushi are incredibly outdated. Some people believe that because women menstruate, they have a warmer body temperature and therefore shouldn't handle the sushi. There are also cultural norms and expectations that make it hard for women to become sushi chefs.
Doing things in the same way as men means first following the existing rules, working the same long hours as men, and not having maternity leave or childcare leave.
In Japan, the path for women is clearly carved. Get married, have a family, and become the primary caretaker. These societal pressures conflict with the grueling long nights and early mornings required to learn sushi. While passion fueled Yuki, it was never easy for her to work in this male-dominated space, and she dealt with sexism from both her coworkers and her customers. But Yuki blazed her own path forward, and since accomplishing her dream of opening up her own restaurant, she has been eager to change the landscape of sushi. She's opened up her own school, the Nadeshiko Sushi Academy, to help female sushi chefs learn the craft in a more inclusive environment. With Yuki and others like her in charge, we are sure to soon see big change and even more innovation in a very traditional craft.
For our last story, Elias Guerra and Taylor Early sat down with a Dutch curator who is changing people's minds about Dutch history by way of their stomachs.
It's 150 years commemorating 1873, the abolishment of the transatlantic slave trade for the Dutch kingdom.
You just heard from Ira Kipp, an Amsterdam-based cultural curator and fundraiser who, with her sister, started a movement to give away free meals yearly on July 1st to remind people of its forgotten history. Although the Dutch arm of the transatlantic slave trade officially ended in 1863, it took 10 years before this practice ended in its colonies, including Suriname. In 2023, Ira and her sister Ira cooked in the royal palace to celebrate Ketikoti, which means the chain is broken in Surinamese. With a group of all-black chefs, they cooked a meal traditionally made by enslaved people called heri heri. This was a really big deal.
Vandaag sta ik hier voor u, als uw koning, En als deel van de regering maak ik vandaag deze excuses zelf.
That's the King of the Netherlands, Willem-Alexander, acknowledging his family and the country's crimes against people of color in its long history. This apology, and the sisters cooking in the palace, although setting the scene for a joyful celebration this year, comes after years of denial and struggle. In the Netherlands, Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete, is a character who accompanies Sinterklaas, which is kind of like the Dutch Santa Claus. Many white Dutch people in the Netherlands, until recently, dressed up as Black Pete, in blackface, and some still do.
For someone who grew up in the Netherlands as a brown-skinned girl, coming from a family that's grown up in the Caribbean, who were mind-tricked in the idea that there was nothing necessarily wrong with that.
In North America, people often look at Europe as the older, more mature sibling. Globally, Europe has touted a post-race society, but its history as a nation is problematic, and its effects today are often unacknowledged.
We do have healthcare, free education. We're very green and clean. That's amazing. We don't have guns, but we do have this really fierce, visible and tangible colonial heritage that we as people of color in this country have to perform daily exercises in our minds to navigate around that and with that.
Ira's mom is from Curaçao and Aruba, and her father is from Suriname. Around 15 years old, Ira became more aware that people dressing up as Zwarte Piet wasn't okay. So in 2020, inspired by Black Lives Matter, Ira started organizing, and Free Hedi Hedi for All was born. The sisters quickly responded to the looming threat of lockdown canceling Ketikoti celebrations that year.
We started in 2020, we're in year 4. We went from 4,000 meals in the first year. We are at 20,000 meals, so it's become huge. And so it's great to multiply the pie, but also to share the pie, like financially.
A few years out, Ira and Ira have built a community that comes together to feed as many people as possible this nourishing, meaningful, and historic dish. So what is Hedi Hedi?
In Suriname, we say gronjang. That means fruits that come out of the gron, out of the ground. And yang is food. It's sweet potatoes, cassave, yuca, plantains, the green bananas, and the yellow plantain, the one that we fry. And then it's saltfish and an egg on top of it.
Each bite of Hedi Hedi speaks to its heritage.
If we would go back in time, you would think saltfish represents the colonial influence on our food. Some say the egg is part of the dish because later people had more wealth. And then the sweet potato and the cassave is also, you have to understand, it's very high in carb. So it was very prevalent in the diet of the enslaved because they could work harder.
To Ira and many people of color across Suriname and the Dutch colonies, this meal not only represents the past, but also the future.
Hiri, the word, means whole. And some say that it's a reference to the fact that you put whole earth fruits in a pot. And others say that it's a reference to healing. The food also heals. So I think I like both narratives.
Food really can bring the past present and also help us heal from our wounds. In Ira's work, it does both. If you're interested in cooking up some Hedi Hedi for your community or supporting Ira and Ira Kip's work with Free Hedi Hedi for All, check out our show notes. And in their words, you eat, you learn.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about the guests and topics we touched on this week by checking out our show notes. Special thanks this week to Liv Kunnitz-Bergowitz, Rana Rudy, and Elia Sciarra. Meat and Three is produced by H. Connolly, Taylor Early, and me, Matt Patterson. Our audio engineer for this episode is H. Connolly. Our theme song was composed by Breakmaster Cylinder. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Meat and Three is powered by Simplecast. Meat and Three is a production of Heritage Radio Network, the world's pioneer food radio station. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org and follow us at heritage_radio. And please stay in touch. Whether you have a story idea or would just like to say hey, write us at ideas@meetand3.nyc. That's all spelled out.